WSDQ Dunlap, WEPG South Pittsburgh, The Copperhead, WSDT Soddy Daisy, Chattanooga.
The viewpoints expressed on LibertyWorks Radio Network are not necessarily those of the network, its affiliates, or sponsors. This is LibertyWorks Radio Network. Now live from coast to coast and around the globe. More real talk, the kind you want, on LibertyWorks Radio Network.
And good afternoon to all of you LibertyWorks Radio listeners out there. This is the Truth Attack Hour. The Truth Attack Hour happens every day, every weekday afternoon, 5 to 6 Central Time, 6 to 7 Eastern Time, 3 to 4 Pacific Time. And it just so happens to be, this is Friday. My name's Larry Becraft. I extend to you a warm invitation to listen to the remainder of the program this afternoon. You know, today is the day, supposedly, I don't know what's happened. I haven't been in front of the boob tube all day long. But supposedly they're going to be voting on whether or not they're going to take witnesses in the Trump impeachment. And supposedly, I have seen some things on the internet that the witness, the opportunity, the motion to call witnesses defeated. So it looks like maybe sometime tonight this tragedy known as the Trump impeachment hearing will end its life. It will die the deserved death it needs. We will no longer have to tolerate the crap that comes out of Adam Schiff's mouth. We no longer have to watch that liar tell us all sorts of lies. Well, that's what's happening today. We also have the Super Bowl coming up on this weekend. So you may be thinking about things like that, but I want to extend to you an invitation to listen to this program this afternoon because my co-host and I are going to be talking about some things that are real important. You know, this is the time of the year that a lot of people refer to as the tax season. And Shaun O'Connor, who's the co-host of this program, and I are firmly convinced that the American people need to know something about this law that most of them have never even looked at the law. They know nothing about it. Well, do you think that there's a real possibility that there may be some real legitimate questions? We think so. So with that in mind, let me bring on this guy from the middle of California by the name of Shaun O'Connor. Shaun, are you with us?
Yes, I am, Larry, and thank you very much. Yep, I'm from what they call the armpit of California, right in the Fresno-Clovis area. But you know what? It's not such a bad armpit. It's the only place in California where you actually have people that believe in the Constitution. The rest of California, it's not so well. But nevertheless, I couldn't agree more with your opening comments. This thing called the impeachment, which I just have to address for a minute if I would be given leisure.
Please. So. What do you know about what's happening today?
As far as with the impeachment?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I find it very interesting how this is a bipartisan thing. Not that I have a party. I really don't. I'm not a party-wise guy. I'm looking at the people that are running for office and trying to figure out what they're trying to figure out. But what I see happening, as far as I'm concerned, is the Democrat Party is just trying to roll over the Constitution with no consequence, and when it comes their turn. When this happens to them, and it will if they're allowed to allow this to happen, they're not going to like it and they're going to change their tune. We're not playing with a story. We're playing with the United States Constitution. That's very important, and it factors in greatly to what you and I are going to talk about in regard to taxation today.
Well, let's get around to talking about that, but let me ask this simple question before we get into the meat of the program. Do you know of anything? Do you know of anything that's happened today regarding the impeachment? Are they going to call witnesses? I think that they're not going to call witnesses. I think that motion was defeated. Do you have any information in that respect? Are we at the end of it?
You know what? I've been watching this, and I know I've got a people that might be angry because I haven't returned their calls because I've been watching this diligently. No, I don't believe they're going to be allowed to call witnesses. I believe that the Democrat Party is going to scream bloody murder about it, as they have been. I do not know if it's going to be over because I do not know what McConnell can do to stop Schumer from introducing motion after motion after motion to make sure this continues until we have the State of the Union address. Again, I'm not a party guy, but this isn't politics anymore. This is messing with our Constitution.
You think Schumer wants to delay this? Now, I think that the State of the Union is going to be next Tuesday night. Am I wrong?
No, I believe you're right.
The 4th.
Yeah, no, I believe you're right. I think it's next Tuesday. And the question becomes this to me is when President Trump, who they won't say president, when President Trump gets up there and he starts talking, I have a few suggestions. I would say, we're going to talk about the State of the Union, but do you know why we're sitting here with an impeachment still impending? It's because the Democrats don't want a vote in November, and they've made it clear. They've made it crystal clear. And I don't care if the Democrats win. I don't care if the Republicans win. I don't care if the Independents win. It's, the Constitution starts with we the people, and that's how it should go down. I
agree. But I'm still curious about this. Are you saying that Chucky Schumer wants this thing to keep on going until Wednesday?
Oh, no. I think he wants it to keep going until, let's say, October.
Wow. Hey, look, but people will get tired of that. People are already tired of it. They'll be tired of it by the time we get into next week.
I agree. I agree 100%.
Misery.
They're already tired of it, and the problem with this whole thing isn't a party thing between the Democrats and the Republicans. It's the Democrats who said we're going to impeach him when he walked down his golden elevator before he was even when he announced his candidacy. They said we're going to impeach him. That must mean they must have known he was going to win. The problem with that is this isn't politics anymore. This isn't a matter of somebody having a nice banner to wave and say, we have a better way to run this country. These people, and when I say these people, I'm saying the people that said we're going to impeach him before he was even elected, are the folks that are sitting there saying, you know what? You can't come in here unless we allow you. That's dangerous.
Correct. Don't upset their apple cart. Hey, they're all crooks. He wants to clean the swamp, and the swamp creatures are objecting. Big time.
That's really crazy too, because I keep hearing Schumer and Schiff and everybody complaining about, well, the FBI said this, the CIA said this. That is exactly the swamp. That is the swamp. I hope the folks in this country are hearing that. That's the swamp. Trump is sitting here saying, you know what? That's got to be cleaned up.
Well, hey, Shaun, let's get around to talking about something that we made a representation to our listeners we would talk about this afternoon.
Okay, very
And that is the constitutional foundations for a lot of things, including the federal income tax. You want to get into that topic?
Yeah, I would like to, very much.
Well,
you want me to start?
Here's what I would like to say. It's real important for these people that are not very knowledgeable about the income tax to have at least a rudimentary understanding of the constitutional basis for that tax. So any discussion before you get into the meats and the mechanics of the income tax should involve, at the outset, a discussion of the constitutional foundation. Would you agree?
I agree wholeheartedly. So take them away.
Well, how about explaining that to our audience?
Okay. Well, there's a couple of principles that I read in the Constitution, and they're pretty simple. And, I pick this thing up once in a while and I read it. And in regard to tonight's discussion is taxes. we have this thing under Article 1, Section 2, that has been written by the forefathers that says representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states. Folks, listen to that. The several states, which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers. That's very important. We're talking about how taxes are going to be enforced by a rule within the United States, not without the United States, within the United States. Now, that had to deal with direct taxes. In other words, taxes that are imposed on you folks that you can't escape. In other words, when the government comes to your door and say, you owe this amount of money, you cannot escape the tax. That's what a direct tax is. There's the rule that I just read you, the rule of apportionment. Now, there's another way to tax in this country that the government allowed for, and the Supreme Court has told us over and over again that all of the powers of taxation has been given to this government, subject to rules. The next rule is under Section 8, Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay in the debts, provide for the common defense and welfare, and such taxes shall be uniform throughout the United States. Now, I didn't read the entire thing, but the rule is all of these kind of taxes announced under Article 1, Section 8 tell you that they must be uniform. That's geographical uniformity. The amount of tax that is imposed upon whatever the subject or the object of the tax is must be uniform. That's within the United States. This is important. We go to the last time that Congress addresses taxes under Section 9, Article 1, Section 9, and they say, no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration. In other words, they're talking about proportionality. The direct tax being laid has to be laid in proportion to the people. It can't be an arbitrary assessment. If a tax is assessed in one state under this direct tax rule, the same amount has to be assessed in every state, according to their population. These are important rules. But here's the deal. I've had a lot of folks call me, and I've discussed it with a lot of people that have read what I have read, and we have gone through these various theories. And they said, well, what is the income tax? Is it a direct tax or indirect tax? Under the United States Constitution, under Article 16, which Larry will address later in the show, it's an indirect tax. Bruce Shaver made this clear as punch. They said that the 16th Amendment made it clear in regard to the Pollock decision, which I'm sure Larry will address, and that was that the income tax is not a direct tax subject to apportionment, and if it is, we've got a really big problem. But Pollock said the way the law has been written, it is a direct tax subject to apportionment. So the government with President Taft got together and said, we're going to have the 16th Amendment and say, hey, guys, you got it wrong. Now, this is not unusual for the legislative branch of government to step up and say, gosh, we didn't like that Supreme Court decision, so we're going to make an amendment or a law that fixes what they think they did wrong. That's what we're going to do. We're going to fix it. That's what they did with the 16th Amendment. And basically, under Bruce Shaver, what the United States Supreme Court got up and said, the 16th Amendment said one thing. This is an indirect tax subject to the rule of uniformity because nothing has changed in this country. We have two types of taxes. A direct tax.
Hey, Shaun? I think I hear the music in the background. When the music's coming on, that lets us know we got a commercial break coming up. Hey, folks, we've got two more segments in this program. Shaun is on a roll. He's telling you about direct and indirect taxes. We'll be back in the next few minutes after this message. Stay tuned. And welcome to the second segment of this afternoon's show. This is the Truth Attack Hour. Now, right before the break, we were being educated by Shaun O'Connor. Now, before Shaun starts back on this, I think it's real important. You know, there's some in this listening audience might, well, how in the world do I get in touch with Shaun O'Connor? Oh, there goes a fire engine by the office. Well, Shaun O'Connor's website is, this is not difficult, ShaunO'Connor.org. Now, Shaun's name it's not S-E-A-N, it's S-H-A-W-N. Shaun, like a real, Irishman or somebody from Scotland, Shaun O'Connor. Well, Shaun, what would be the national origin of Shaun O'Connor? Would that be Scottish or Irish?
Well, it's up for debate. I've actually researched it, and some folks take the position that Shaun, S-E-A-N, is Irish, or S-H-A-N-W is Irish, or we have, as you were saying, Larry, various interpretations of it. I'm not entirely sure, but I know one thing. I had a long discussion with my dad. He assured me I'm Irish.
Good enough. Well, hey, Shaun, before the break, you were on the topic of, the constitutional foundation for the federal income tax, and I'd like for you to continue along, if you're not through with that, offering your explanation, and then I would like to offer some of my comments.
Okay, and I'm going to abbreviate this really quick, and I apologize for the listening audience that I might have got a little off on where I was going. Here was where I was going when I was talking about the power of direct and indirect taxation, the powers that have been given to the federal government through the United States Constitution, and the rules by which they must abide. Those rules apply within the United States. They do not apply outside the United States. And here's simply my proposition. If the United States government wants to assert an income tax within the United States, Bruce Shaber has explained explicitly, you certainly can do that, but it's an excise tax subject to the rule of uniformity. That's the bottom line. However, outside the United States, the government, as far as I'm concerned, can tax any person, anywhere, any government in this world, and they have no rules by which they have to do it. Think about this for a minute. You've been hearing about the Democrats screaming bloody murder about the imposts and excise taxes that are being imposed by Trump to get these several governments into line and finally give the United States government, well, not the United States government, the United States people, a break and say, hey, wait a minute, we're part of this world too, and we don't have to pay for everything. Do you ever hear any government branch, whether it's the legislature, whether it's the deep state, whether it's the presidential office, do you ever hear them saying when you impose an excise tax outside of the United States, there is a rule? No, you don't. You know why? Because it doesn't exist within the Constitution. The rules of taxation regarding indirect taxes apply within the United States. Larry, with that, I'll give it off to you. And
that is so true. That is so true. These rules of the Constitution stops at the high water mark or low water mark, all the way around the country. But then, of course, if you're dealing with the federal government, it extends out 12 miles because the Uncle Sam's got this sea jurisdiction. But, after you get beyond Uncle Sam's sea jurisdiction, you soon get into international waters. But, the United States Constitution primarily applies. It certainly doesn't apply abroad. And I'll give you a case that deals with that. And this is a case that went to the United States Supreme Court. This dealt with some federal law enforcement people going down to Mexico to grab somebody and bring them back. And that happened, and an argument was made in court in reference to that case. There was this constitutional argument being made for this Mexican national who was drugged to the United States, he was making an argument, well, hey, these guys violated the United States Constitution. And the Supreme, and I think it was the Ninth Circuit said, well, the United States Constitution doesn't apply down in Mexico. So he had no constitutional rights that were violated by, federal law enforcement officials going down to Mexico, grabbing him and bringing him back. So Shaun is absolutely correct that the United States Constitution, let's forget about, the ocean side of the United States. Let's just talk about the landmass. That is where the United States Constitution applies. And these rules regarding taxation outside the country, this is something a lot of people have a real problem dealing with. How does, Uncle Sam impose a tax outside of the United States? Well, there are places outside the United States that Uncle Sam has tremendous power. And over the years, the United States, through international agreements, has been able to get territorial insular possessions. We've had the Philippines at one time were under the jurisdiction of the United States. We've got Guam and American Samoa. At one time, we had the Panama Canal Zone. Places like that are outside the United States. Uncle Sam still has power there. But the Supreme Court has said that in those places outside the United States, which is the 50 states that have been admitted into the Union, in those types of places, Uncle Sam has the power of a state legislature. And so these problems regarding excise taxes and direct taxes that are embodied within the United States Constitution in reference to, when those provisions apply within the United States, those are prohibitions that simply do not apply to Uncle Sam in the territories and the insular possessions. Those parts of those geographical areas that the federal government has jurisdiction over that are not within the United States. Now, Shaun, is that something that's understandable to people, about where the Constitution applies and where it doesn't apply?
I hopefully, I think it should be. I'm not sure it is, but I'll tell you what, Larry, you're really hitting on a good point, and I hope that you will continue on that to ensure that folks are really understanding what you're saying.
Okay, now, here's, I think Shaun brought this point about, the constitutional application. That's something that a lot of people don't understand, and they don't understand the two fundamental types of taxes that Uncle Sam can impose. Now, there are two, when you go back to the United States, the Philadelphia Convention, let's go back to that time frame, and I'd like to put some of those events into play. At that time, there was a United States of America, and it was embodied within the Continental Congress. But the Articles of Confederation that created the Continental Congress was simply an agreement between these state governments. It was the state governments that created the United States under the Articles of Confederation. But that government had no power of taxation. That government, under the Articles of Confederation, was completely dependent upon, the states making their contributions to operate the federal government. And so in 1787, in the summer of 1787, there was a convention in Philadelphia, the purpose of which was originally to revise the Articles of Confederation. But when all the delegates got there, they reached the conclusion, well, we're just going to have to amend the whole thing. We're going to have to come up with a whole brand new constitution. And that's what they did. And in that process, they said, well, the federal government's got to have a power of taxation. But at that time, as today, the state governments, they were getting most of their taxation from taxes that are known as direct taxes. Direct taxes are imposed upon people and things. The people pay if you own real property, and every year you got to pay your property taxes. That is a direct tax imposed by the state government. And that is the type of taxes that the state governments were collecting back then. And they didn't want this new government, known as the United States of America, to invade their tax source. And so a decision was made by the Philadelphia Convention that they were going to have to give a power of taxation to the federal government that was not being used by the states, and that was the indirect taxes, and primarily on imports. That was the design of the United States Constitution, that the federal government would primarily operate off of indirect taxes. Now, once this decision was made, they had this. The Constitution provides for, as the Constitutional Convention ultimately drafted these provisions. They said, well, these indirect taxes, which is their excises, duties, and imposts, they've just simply got to be imposed by the rule of uniformity. Now, the rule of uniformity is something that people can understand. When you pull up to a gas pump and put some gas in your car, and, I don't know whether it's this way in all states, but here in Alabama, you can look at the gas pump, and, they'll tell there's some little comments up there, some picture graphs or something like that will show you how much you're paying in the way of state and federal taxes. Well, whatever the gas tax is in Alabama, the federal gas tax, it's going to be the same all across the country. That is uniformity. If there's a tax on cigarettes, if there's a tax on booze, if there's a tax on any other item that's like a sales tax imposed by Uncle Sam, it's just simply got to be uniform across the country. That's what uniformity is. The primary sources of revenue for Uncle Sam were envisioned by the Constitutional Convention being duties on imports, and then something like sales taxes imposed internally. Now, for most of the period of time that before we went up to the Civil War, the Uncle Sam primarily operated off of the money imposed upon commodities that were coming into this country being imported. That was the primary source of revenue for Uncle Sam. Now, during the War of 1812, Congress was required to impose some direct taxes, but they imposed direct taxes for, I think, only 2 years, and then thereafter it stopped. And then the next time that direct taxes were imposed at the federal level, it was during the Civil War. So this short history shows to you that, the Philadelphia Convention that drafted the Constitution and specifically debated and wrote the taxing provisions that are in the United States Constitution, there's a history behind this, and there's a reason for all of these taxing powers having certain limitations. Now, here's a very interesting question. Historically, and if you want to know something more about this, get on the internet and get a book called what is Phil Hart's book, Shaun?
Phil Hart's book is Constitutional Income. Do you have any?
Yes. Well, Phil Hart's book, Phil Hart's book is real good, offers a real good historical discussion of what I've been over. So if you want to know more about this, get Phil Hart's book. All you have to do is type in Phil Hart, H-A-R-T. He's from Idaho. He lives up there lives and works in Coeur d'Alene, and he wrote a book called Constitutional Income. Do you have any? And it lays out this history behind direct taxes and indirect taxes. Now, Phil, well, what is a direct tax that is required to be apportioned? And he goes back
LibertyWorks Radio Network, enlightening you to the real problems we face in our constitutional republic.
And welcome back to our final segment of this afternoon show. Now, right before that last break, I did not hear the music coming on, and I kept rolling along, and probably there's probably some things I need to restate all over again. Let me put it in these simple terms. There's a reason why the United States Constitution has given taxing powers to the federal government, and there's reasons why of the two broad categories of taxes that can be imposed, direct and indirect, that there are rules for the imposition of those types of taxes. And if you want to know something about that, if you want a little bit better explanation, look up on the internet. Phil Hart wrote a great book called Constitutional Income, Do You Have Any? And, of course, Phil's purpose in writing that book was to deal with the subject of income, what it really is. But, in doing that, Phil went back and he did a lot of historical research regarding the taxing powers, and he kind of lays it out. Now, one of the things that Phil Hart's book points out is back there in in rebellion against Great Britain, there was a man, an economist by the name of Adam Smith, who wrote a great book called The Wealth of Nations. And in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, a very famous economist, somebody that has a well-known reputation, somebody that's held in high regard, he reached this conclusion, that to tax incomes was to exercise the power of direct taxation. Now, there's a lot of similar authority, that for the federal government to tax incomes, the income, the subject of the tax, that can only be reached by means of a direct tax in most situations. So, what happened in this country in reference to the income tax? Why did we get the 16th Amendment? Well, back in, every time Congress has come along and imposed a new tax, for example, a tax on state banknotes. That tax was imposed right after the Civil War to drive out of circulation currency notes, banknotes that have been issued by state banks. There was a tax imposed upon them, I think of 10%, and the purpose of that was to drive those banknotes out of circulation. Now, you heard this old expression, the power to tax is the power to destroy. And the federal tax on state banknotes is, you can see from that example that the power to tax is the power to destroy. And what was the consequence of this tax on state banknotes? State banknotes went out of circulation. They ceased to circulate. Nobody wanted to pay the tax, and there were the banknotes issued by the federally chartered national banks that could circulate untaxed. And so that's the reason that, if you go back into the history of the monetary system in this country, that's one event that, it happened back in those days. And, the national banks were just one step in the progression of events that ultimately led to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. But I digress. Quite often when a new tax, like an estate tax or the state tax on banknotes or some other type of tax, a tax on the aliens getting off of ships coming into this country. They're immigrants. It's a tax on immigrants, constitutional. So every time that there's a tax imposed at the federal level that's new, somebody's going to come along and mount a challenge. And typically those types of taxes, since, taxes that are imposed by means of a uniform percentage, those are easy to impose. Those are the types of taxes Congress inevitably drafts and enacts. Somebody's going to come along and say, oh, this is an unconstitutional direct tax. Now, in 1894, Congress comes along and imposes an income tax. And as I mentioned, it was uniform. It's real easy to impose a uniform tax. And Congress imposed a uniform income tax this time. And the challenge that was brought was this: it's unconstitutional because it is a direct tax, and since it's only uniform and not apportioned, it's unconstitutional. In that case, the Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust case, it started in 1894, ended in 1895, and to make a long story short, the gist of this very long opinion that it's a good legal history of taxation here in America. In that Pollock case, if you want to sit down and learn some history, read about some history, if you want to study it, that's a good source for the legal history of taxation at the federal level here in this country. But ultimately, the court concluded that it was unconstitutional. That income tax was unconstitutional. In that circumstance was the exercise of the power of direct taxation, and since that tax was not apportioned, it was unconstitutional. Now let's get back around to what Shaun was talking about earlier. He started off on this, and I'm going to pick up where he left off, so to speak. He was talking about, these rules for imposition of taxes, uniformity for indirect taxes and apportionment for direct taxes, those don't apply outside the country. So if you were in Guam, or Puerto Rico, or the Virgin Islands, where the Constitution doesn't apply, then Congress could impose an income tax in those areas, and even though constitutionally the income tax would be, from an internal viewpoint, would be the exercise of the direct taxing power, it could be imposed in whatever manner Congress wanted to do in those areas. And the reason why is these constitutional limitations that relate to taxes do not apply in those geographical areas. Now let's move forward, and we're almost to the end of the program. I want to ask a few questions of Shaun before we have to say goodbye for this evening. In 1909, Congress comes along and imposes or proposes the 16th Amendment, sends it to the states for ratification. Now, Philander Knox proclaimed the 16th Amendment as having been ratified, but, Bill Benson researched the question of whether or not the 16th Amendment was properly and lawfully ratified, and he reached the conclusion failed to be legally ratified, but let's ignore that problem for the time being. Philander Knox came along on February the 25th of 1913 and said, the 16th Amendment has been ratified. And by October of 1913, Congress comes along and enacts the first income tax under the 16th Amendment. And just like in 1894, when Pollock instituted his suit against Farmers Loan and Trust to challenge the 1894 income tax, now a guy by the name of Bruce Shaver does the same thing, and he sues the Union Pacific Railroad because they're implementing the 1913 Act, and he's got some arguments that the 1913 Act is, got some real problems. And that case gets pushed up to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court in early 1916 comes out with its decision. Now, here's something I want our listeners to be cognizant of. Justice White was a brand new justice on the Supreme Court in 1894. In the Pollock case, the majority held, the 1894 income tax is unconstitutional because it's a direct tax, and it had been imposed without apportionment. Well, White, being a new justice back in those in 1894, he came out with a dissent. And he said, no, a federal income tax is an excise tax, and so therefore it was constitutional. Well, now, by the time you get into 1915, 1916, guess who is the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court? The guy that had been on the court for 20 years and more. Chief Justice White, who wrote a dissenting opinion in the Pollock case. Now he is Chief Justice. And as Chief Justice, he assigns to himself the writing of the opinion in the Bruchaber case. And he comes along and he writes, in essence, just kind of summarize. Now, argument about what the Bruchaber case means. Everybody's kind of in agreement that, the Supreme Court justifies, the federal income tax by saying, that the 16th Amendment has something to do with, making the federal income tax an excise tax. There seems to be a basic agreement there regarding that. But in any event, the Bruchaber court says, well, gee, the income tax that the 16th Amendment authorizes is one that falls within the classification of being an excise tax. Now, here's something I want to suggest. Shaun?
Yep.
Are you with us?
I'm here. Yeah, I'm here.
An immigrant coming into this country, does he have a right to be here?
No, he doesn't have a right to be here.
Does
he has
have
a privilege?
A constitutional right to work?
No, he doesn't.
Oh, those are privileges?
Yeah, absolutely, no question about it. In my mind, there's no question about that, Larry.
Okay. So, a lot of people come along and make this argument. Here's broadly what a direct tax is. These are the parameters of a direct tax. This is the definition of a direct tax. But everybody's kind of in agreement about what an excise tax is. And everybody's in agreement that an excise tax includes a tax imposed upon a privilege. It's a privilege tax. For the most basic understanding of an excise tax is that it is a privilege tax. And there's whole books written on this. You got Otto Skinner wrote a book on it. It's an excise tax. An excise tax is a privilege tax. So, my question is that, if the 16th Amendment, according to the Supreme Court, conferred no new powers of taxation, is it possible that Chief Justice White in the Bruchaber case comes along and, comes up with this solution? Hey, the 16th Amendment really didn't amend the Constitution. It just sets out a principle that, all income taxes at the federal level have got to be not direct.
Yeah,
not imposed
Larry, that seems to be pretty much self-evident from the Constitution and Justice White's decision. And I'm so glad you brought up Justice White. I hear very little people talk about where he came in to the Supreme Court and his different opinions. But I think that's great that you're bringing that up. And again, I would remind everybody that's listening that the principles of taxation we're talking about when it comes to uniformity and direct taxation apply within the United States. After that, it's, hey, whatever we want to do.
Well, but here's Shaun, here's the point I just simply want to make, and we're almost to the end of the program. I just want our listeners to put this in their thinking cap. If the 16th Amendment didn't change the rule regarding direct taxes, certain types of direct taxes, is there a possibility that there is a type of an income tax that can really be an excise? And an income tax on the income of aliens would be one. Hey, Shaun, the music's on. Hey, folks, we'll be back next week.